I used to think my life was perfect. Leila, my wife, and I had built a beautiful home in a quiet suburb. Our life together was a picture of harmony, matching coffee mugs, Friday movie nights, and a shared love for gardening. People around us would often comment on how lucky we were, how we seemed like the perfect couple. But those comments, however flattering, now ring hollow in my ears. The truth is, perfection is an illusion, and I was blind to the cracks that had begun to form in our relationship. At first, I didn't notice them, or maybe I didn't want to. Leila worked in marketing, a field that required frequent business trips, often leaving me to manage things at home alone. I trusted her completely, as any husband would. Why wouldn't I? She was my partner, my confidant. I was content with my simple job managing a supply chain team, and I admired her ambition. She was outgoing, the life of every party, while I, on the other hand, preferred to stay in the background. Our differences complemented each other, or so I thought. But in the months leading up to that fateful discovery, things started to change. Little by little, Leila began coming home later and later. At first, I told myself it was just work, that her projects were demanding her attention more than usual. But then came the subtle signs. The way she would cling to her phone, giggling at messages she never shared with me. Whenever I asked, she would smile and say it was just work stuff or just the girls. It was always the same answer, and I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. But then there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when a small, nagging doubt crept into my mind. One night, I woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I noticed the faint glow of Leila's phone screen. She must have forgotten it there, I thought. I didn't think much of it at first, but curiosity soon got the better of me. I knew it was wrong to pry, but it felt like fate had led me to this very moment. I picked up her phone, hesitated for a split second, and unlocked it. She had always trusted me with her passcode, never once suspecting that I might ever breach her privacy. I told myself I was just checking her messages to ensure everything was okay. But what I found shattered the trust one once had in her and in myself. The first message I saw was from someone named Evan. "Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was amazing." My heart stopped. My hand trembled, and for a moment, everything around me faded. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears as I read the words over and over again. Last night was amazing. What did that even mean? My mind raced, spinning in confusion. I scrolled back through the conversation, praying for an innocent explanation. But the messages only deepened my sense of betrayal. Late-night meetups, romantic emojis, inside jokes, everything I hadn't been a part of. The messages didn't just speak of a fling. They spoke of something deeper, more intimate. It wasn't just an affair. It was an emotional connection I wasn't even aware of. I put the phone back exactly where I had found it, stood there for a moment, and stared out the window. The weight of the discovery sank in slowly. A storm was building inside me, one I couldn't ignore. I had questions. So many questions. Who was Evan? How long had this been going on? Why had Leila lied to my face for so long? I spent hours that night sitting in the living room, replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The way she'd stopped kissing me goodbye in the mornings. The new lingerie I never saw her wear. The sudden gym memberships. The girls' nights out. Things that never seemed out of place at the time now seemed like red flags. It all made sense now. But what hurt the most wasn't the affair itself. It was the realization that I had been blind to it all. I had trusted her, given her my loyalty, and in return, she had betrayed me. When the sun finally rose, the initial wave of pain began to shift, replaced by something darker, more potent: anger. No, it wasn't just anger. It was a quiet, controlled fury. I wasn't just angry at Leila for betraying me. I was angry at myself for being so naive, so trusting, for being weak. Leila came downstairs that morning, smiling, asking if I wanted pancakes for breakfast, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with. But in that moment, I realized she didn't see me as a threat. She thought I was harmless, easy to ignore. She had no idea what I was capable of. And that was her first mistake. Because Leila had no idea who I used to be, and I was about to remind her. I couldn't act immediately. Revenge isn't something you rush. It takes patience, planning, and precision. I knew I had to get proof, undeniable evidence of her betrayal. Before I could confront her, I couldn't go to her with just suspicions. I needed to be sure. So I played my part. That morning, I smiled, ate the pancakes she made, kissed her on the cheek, and headed off to work. Inside, though, I was boiling. The image of Leila laughing with Evan was burned into my mind, but I pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time for emotions. Now was the time for action. At lunch, I contacted a private investigator. His name was Dale, and he came highly recommended online. When we met later that evening at a coffee shop, I laid everything out. I told him I suspected my wife was having an affair and that I needed proof. Photos, texts, locations, anything. Dale, with a wry grin, assured me, "Discreet is my middle name. You'll have what you need in no time." The next few days felt like an eternity. Leila went on about her usual routine, laughing, chatting, and even mentioning a business trip she had planned for the weekend. My stomach churned as she casually spoke about leaving town, knowing full well she was probably going to meet Evan. But still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. 3 days later, Dale called. "Jack, you were right," he said, his voice grim. "I've got everything. Photos, timestamps, the whole shebang." I met him that evening in his office. What he showed me left me cold. Photos of Leila walking into a fancy downtown hotel with Evan, screenshots of their text conversations, details of their planned weekend getaway. It wasn't just a casual affair. This was something deeper, something that had been brewing for a long time. As I stared at the evidence, something inside me began to shift. My sadness, my heartbreak, they started to fade. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't feel the need to lash out. No, instead I started thinking, every betrayal deserves consequences. And I was going to make sure Leila and Evan faced theirs. Leila had no idea what she had set in motion. The plan I had carefully constructed was now in its final stages, and she was completely oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf her. Her life, which she thought she had control over, was unraveling before her eyes. And the best part? She still thought I was the same harmless man I used to be. The days following her business trip were a blur. I watched as she scrambled to save her career, to piece together the shattered remnants of the life she had so carelessly destroyed. She hadn't yet realized that everything she had built, her career, her social circle, her so-called perfect marriage, was crumbling under the weight of her own choices. I, on the other hand, was calm, collected, and focused. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control. No more was I the man who had blindly trusted, the man who had been the fool. The old Jack had disappeared, and in his place stood someone who was sharp, strategic, and determined to make those who wronged him pay. The first few days after Leila's return from her business trip were spent in silence. Leila, desperate to salvage what was left of her reputation, threw herself into damage control. But every effort she made was in vain. The cracks in her carefully constructed facade were becoming more apparent, and people were starting to take notice. One evening, she came home from work looking pale and frazzled. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that I found almost amusing. She barely spoke to me, her mind clearly preoccupied with the mess she had created. "Jack," she finally said, breaking the silence, "I'm really scared. Things at work are getting worse. HR is looking into the allegations. People are talking. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." I watched her carefully, taking in her every word, her every gesture. There was no doubt in my mind that she was terrified, but what I found most interesting was how she still hadn't connected the dots. She didn't know that it was me, her once trusting husband, who had orchestrated everything. The anonymous tip to HR, the photos, the text messages. She thought someone else was behind it all, someone who wanted to ruin her life. But the truth was much more simple. It was her own choices that had led to her downfall. "You'll get through this, Leila," I said calmly, my voice barely a whisper. "It's just a misunderstanding. Everything will work itself out." She looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation, but I could see the flicker of doubt in them. She wasn't so sure anymore, and that, for me, was the sweet taste of victory. It wasn't just about exposing her infidelity anymore. It was about watching her unravel, piece by piece, as she realized the full extent of her actions. But I wasn't done yet. The next step in my plan was to turn the heat up on Evan, the man who had so casually waltzed into my marriage, thinking he could have my wife, thinking he could take what was mine. He was about to face the consequences of his own vices. I'd already uncovered everything about him. His gambling problem, his debts, his shady business dealings. I had a choice. I could have gone after him directly, but I wanted to make sure he suffered without ever knowing who had caused his downfall. So I made a few discreet calls. I contacted some of his more unsavory creditors and let them know about his recent activities. I didn't need to threaten him directly. I knew that the pressure from his past would do all the work for me. It wasn't long before Evan started to feel the heat. I could see the changes in him. When Leila spoke about him, she was still so concerned, so worried about him. But I knew that deep down, she was starting to wonder whether he was worth all the trouble. His gambling debts were starting to eat away at him. The calls, the threats, the visits. It was all taking its toll. But what was most delicious was knowing that Leila was beginning to feel the consequences of her actions too. One night, she came home looking even more frazzled than before. "Jack, I need to talk to you," she said, pacing the living room. "Evan's in trouble. People are after him. He's getting these calls, these threats. It's bad, Jack. Really bad." I could barely keep the smirk off my face. It was almost too easy. She was caught between her affair and the fallout from her job, and she still hadn't figured out the truth. "Do you think he'll be okay?" I asked, feigning concern. Inside, I was reveling in her misery. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "Everything's falling apart. My job, my relationship with Evan. I just don't know what to do." That was when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. She had no idea that I was the one pulling all the strings. She had no idea that I was the one who had methodically planned her destruction. The worst part? She thought she was the victim in all of this. But I wasn't done yet. The final blow was the most satisfying of all: public exposure. Leila thrived on her image, her career, her friendships, her status. These were the things that defined her, and I knew that if I could take all of that away, she would be left with nothing. I created an anonymous email account, carefully crafting a message to send to all of her closest friends and family. I included the photos of Leila and Evan, along with excerpts from their texts and a brief message. "You deserve to know the truth." It didn't take long for the email to make its rounds. Within hours, Leila's phone started to buzz incessantly. Her friends texted her, questioning her, accusing her. Her mother called, crying and demanding answers. The whispers spread like wildfire, and Leila, for the first time, was powerless. She confronted me that evening, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Did you send those photos? Did you ruin my life?" I stood there, calm as ever, and looked her in the eye. "Why would I do that, Leila?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "I didn't even know you were seeing someone else." Her eyes widened. For the first time, she looked at me with genuine fear. She had finally realized the truth. The walls had come crashing down, and there was no way to fix it, no way to undo the damage. "I can explain," she said, her voice pleading. "I made a mistake, Jack. A huge mistake." I shook my head, cutting her off. "No, Leila, you made a choice, and now you're dealing with the consequences." Her sobs filled the room as she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. But it was too late. There was no redemption for her, no forgiveness. Leila's life continued to spiral from there. Her company fired her, citing a breach of ethical conduct. Evan disappeared, unable to face the mess he had created. Her friends, who once adored her, began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with her scandal. Leila had no one left to turn to. At home, she barely spoke. Her once vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a shell of the woman I had once loved. She moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by her own decisions. And I couldn't care less. The final act was the divorce, but not just any divorce. I wasn't going to let her get away with anything. She had everything I had worked for, and now it was time to take it all back. My lawyer, Lauren, made sure that every detail was taken care of. The financial settlements, the custody arrangements, everything was set in my favor. Leila wouldn't be able to touch a thing. I walked into that lawyer's office and signed the papers. It was done. Leila never saw it coming. She thought she had all the power, all the control, but in the end, I was the one who had the last word. As I walked away from the wreckage of my marriage, I knew that I had learned an important lesson. Never, ever underestimate the man who has nothing left to lose. Watching Leila struggle to keep her life from falling apart was oddly satisfying. The person who once had everything seemed to be unraveling in front of my eyes, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. She spent hours on the phone, desperately trying to patch up her relationships, scrambling to fix the mess she had made at work. The cracks in her once perfect appearance were now glaringly obvious. Her hair, once meticulously styled, was now unkempt. Her makeup was smudged. The carefully crafted facade of confidence was shattered. Her clothes, always neat and pristine, now hung on her like a reminder of her crumbling world. One evening, as I watched her sit at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone, I knew it was time. Time to sever the last thread connecting us. I had already been planning this moment for months, and now I was ready. I slid the divorce papers across the table without a word. Her eyes widened as she looked up at me, a mix of confusion and disbelief written across her face. What is this? Divorce papers, I said, my voice colder than I'd ever intended. It's over, Leila. Her hands trembled as she picked up the papers, her eyes scanning them as though she couldn't believe what she was reading. You can't be serious, Jack. Please, can we talk about this? There's nothing to talk about, I replied, my tone final, unyielding. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't feel the sympathy I might have once felt. I didn't feel the anger or bitterness I'd held onto for so long. There was just an emptiness, a sense of finality. Leila wasn't crying because she regretted what she had done to me. She was crying because she was losing everything. Her marriage, her comfortable life, her illusion of control. The divorce process was swift, meticulously planned. Lauren, my trusted ally, helped me make sure Leila was left with nearly nothing. The assets that had once been shared between us had already been moved into my own accounts, untouchable. The evidence of her affair was damning, and I used it to secure the house, the savings, and almost every other asset we had. Leila, on the other hand, was sinking fast. The debt she had accumulated was staggering. Her unemployment benefits barely covered her basic expenses, and the scandal had made it nearly impossible for her to find a job in her field. Evan, the man she had risked everything for, had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, though I had a pretty good idea. He was likely running from the creditors I had tipped off. Leila tried reaching out to him multiple times, but every call was met with silence. The man she had believed would be her savior had abandoned her, leaving her to face the consequences alone. By the time the divorce was finalized, Leila's life was unrecognizable. She had been forced to move into a dingy one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the life she once lived. Her social media accounts, once filled with photos of exotic vacations and glamorous parties, were now silent. Her friends had all but disappeared, and even her family seemed to be keeping their distance. The whispers behind her back were louder than ever, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction knowing that people now saw her for who she truly was. One day, unexpectedly, Leila showed up at the house, my house. She stood at the doorstep, her face gaunt, her eyes red from crying. She looked nothing like the woman I had once known. "Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But please, can we try again? I'll do anything." I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the Leila I had married. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had betrayed me, lied to me, and thought she could get away with it. I shook my head slowly. "No, Leila," I said firmly, my voice unwavering. "Done. You made sure of that." She collapsed onto the porch, sobbing uncontrollably, but I didn't let her inside. I closed the door softly behind me, leaving her with her broken heart and shattered dreams. I walked away, not looking back, knowing that I had made the right decision. She had underestimated me, thinking I would be weak, that I wouldn't fight back. But I had shown her the truth. Even the kindest people have limits, and when those limits are crossed, there's no telling what they're capable of. In the weeks that followed, I began rebuilding my life. The house, once filled with the noise and chaos of our marriage, was now silent. For the first time in years, I could hear myself think. The emptiness that had once consumed me was slowly replaced with a sense of peace. I started rediscovering parts of myself I had forgotten. My love for music, my interest in woodworking, my desire to live life on my own terms. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and it felt good. Leila, on the other hand, was crumbling. Words spread quickly about her downfall, and people whispered about the woman who once had everything but had lost it all. I didn't keep tabs on her, but the stories came to me. She was struggling to make ends meet, unable to get a job in her field, living in a small, cramped apartment, alone. The pain she had caused me was now something she was living with every day. One day, I received a letter. It was from Leila. I didn't expect to hear from her again, but there it was, sitting in my mailbox. I opened it and read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it in a drawer. Jack, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. Not just for the affair, but for taking you for granted. You were a good husband, and I threw it all away for something meaningless. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I hope one day you can forgive me. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't even feel relief. I just felt acceptance. Leila's apology didn't change anything. It didn't erase the pain, the betrayal, or the months of suffering. But it was the closest thing to closure I would ever get. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer, locking away that chapter of my life for good. I began planning my departure from the town. It wasn't that I hated the place. It was just filled with too many memories, good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. I needed to leave, to start fresh, far from the ghosts of the past. With the assets I had secured in the divorce, I had the freedom to go wherever I wanted. I decided to move to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, a place I had always dreamed of living. The air was crisp, the landscape was serene, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. I found work at a local hardware store, started volunteering at a community center, and even adopted a dog. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. It was real. Occasionally, I thought about Leila. I wondered if she would ever find her way back to happiness, or if the choices she had made would haunt her forever. But I didn't dwell on those thoughts. My life was no longer tied to hers, and that in itself was liberating. Looking back, I didn't regret what I had done. Leila had underestimated me, assumed I was too weak, too naive to stand up for myself. But I had proven her wrong. Even the kindest people have limits, and when those limits are crossed, there's no telling what they're capable of.